John Harrison's day began like any other, tucked into the routine of his high-powered life. The sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his mansion, casting a soft glow over the vast expanse of modern furniture. As a self-made millionaire, John had built his empire on real estate and technology, a world where the next deal was always just around the corner. Yet, for all the luxury that surrounded him, his sleek car collection, the sprawling estate, and the penthouse overlooking the city, there was something hollow about his mornings. He rubbed his eyes, stretched out of bed, and glanced at the clock. 6:45 a.m. It was early, but he had a jam-packed day ahead. Meetings, negotiations, presentations, his entire world revolved around these things. The demands of being a successful entrepreneur had long ago driven any semblance of a personal life to the margins. His thoughts briefly flickered to Emily, his ex-wife, but he quickly pushed them aside. It had been 15 years since they parted ways, and even though she had been a constant presence in his past, he couldn't remember the last time he allowed himself to dwell on their shared history. He dressed quickly, opting for a tailored suit that gave him the appearance of someone who had everything under control. As he looked in the mirror, adjusting his tie, he caught a glimpse of his face, a face that had aged more in recent years than he cared to admit. There were lines around his eyes, not just from the stress of his work, but from something deeper, something unspoken. The memory of Emily, her soft smile, and the way her eyes had looked at him when they first met seemed distant, like a faint echo he couldn't quite grasp. But he didn't have time for nostalgia. Today was about business, as it always was. He walked down the staircase of his mansion, greeted by his housekeeper, who handed him his briefcase. His assistant called to remind him about an urgent meeting with a potential investor. John nodded absent-mindedly. "Tell them I'll be there in 20. After a quick breakfast, he was out the door, making his way to the garage, where his black sports car gleamed in the early morning light. He slid into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life as he sped off toward the local mall. It wasn't part of his usual routine, but he had some personal errands to run. Business had occupied every moment of his life for years, and there was a small part of him that recognized he needed to take a step back, even if only for a few hours. The drive was uneventful. He glanced out the window, admiring the busy streets of the city, the towering buildings, and the throngs of people going about their daily lives. He rarely allowed himself to notice such things anymore, always too focused on what was next. But today felt different. There was a quiet unease, an unexplained sense of restlessness gnawing at him. He pulled into the parking lot of the mall, his car barely slowing as he found a spot. The mall was busy, bustling with people in every direction. Parents with children, teenagers on their phones, and elderly couples leisurely walking by. It was a scene of normalcy, a stark contrast to his often chaotic life. John took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. His shoes clicked sharply on the pavement as he entered the mall. He didn't plan to linger, but something about the place caught his attention. He was supposed to pick up a few items for an upcoming business event, nothing that required much thought. Yet, as he walked through the entrance, he felt an odd pull, a sense of anticipation in the air that he couldn't quite place. He walked through the large atrium, his eyes scanning the stores. The mall was like any other, filled with the usual brands and storefronts, but for some reason, it all felt unfamiliar. John had always been a man who thrived in high-end environments, exclusive boutiques, and luxury shopping districts, but this was different. This was a place for families, for ordinary people going about their lives. His mind was already elsewhere, on his meetings, his career, the next deal that would push him further up the ladder. But then something stopped him in his tracks. In the middle of the bustling crowd, he saw them. 2 teenagers, about 15 years old, walking toward him. They were laughing, chatting with each other, completely unaware of the businessman standing frozen in place. The girl had dark brown hair, tied up in a messy bun, and a tall, slender figure that was immediately familiar to him. The boy beside her had the same features, same eyes, same shape of the face. It was as if they were looking at reflections of each other. For a moment, John felt a jolt of recognition, something deep within him stirred. He couldn't place it, but there was something in their expressions, something in their demeanor, that felt unsettlingly familiar. Then, the girl's voice cut through the noise of the crowd. She said something that caught John off guard, something that sent a chill down his spine. "Can you believe we're finally here, Luke? At the mall, just like Dad always promised we'd do when we were older." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. John's heart skipped a beat. His legs felt like they might give way beneath him. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. Dad? They were talking about him. But how could they know? He hadn't been part of their lives for 15 years. Emily had made sure of that when she took the kids and left. The twins, his twins, were standing there, talking about him as though he had been an active part of their lives. John's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts swirling through him, but one thought stood out above all the rest. These are my children. He had abandoned them. He had walked away from them, from Emily, from everything. He had been too focused on his career, too consumed by the drive for success, to realize that the people he loved most were slipping away. As he stared at them, his mind flashed back to the day he had walked out of their lives. The memory of Emily's tear-streaked face, her quiet voice begging him to reconsider, echoed in his ears. But he had been too determined, too certain that his path was the only one that mattered. He had promised them he would come back, that they would be a family again. But he never did. He left. And now, standing in front of him, were two teenagers who bore his face, his blood, but were strangers to him in every other sense. John tried to move forward, to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His throat felt dry, his heart pounding. The girl, Lily, turned and caught sight of him, her eyes narrowing as if trying to place him. A flicker of recognition passed between them, but it was brief. She said something to Luke, and they both stopped walking. John took a tentative step toward them, his mind spinning with confusion and fear. He wanted to say something, but what? What did you say to children you had abandoned? What could he say to make up for the years of absence? He was never prepared for this moment. Never prepared for the consequences of his past decisions. And yet, here they were. His children, his flesh and blood, staring back at him with eyes that saw right through him. It was a moment that John would never forget. It was the moment his past caught up with him, and everything he thought he knew about his life shattered in an instant. John's heart raced as he stood frozen in front of the twins, unable to move or speak. The noise of the mall, the hustle and bustle of shoppers, all seemed to fade into the background. Time slowed, and in that moment, John felt as if the weight of his past decisions had finally caught up with him. The twins, Lily and Luke, stood just a few feet away, their eyes locking with his, as if they were both trying to figure out who he was, and whether they should care. Lily was the first to break the silence. Her eyes scanned him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. There was a subtle but unmistakable recognition in the way she looked at him, the same way Emily had looked at him all those years ago when things started to fall apart. Her voice, when it came, was soft but edged with a hint of anger. "Do I know you?" she asked, the words cutting through the tension like a knife. John swallowed hard, his throat dry. He took a shaky step toward them, unsure of what to say, how to explain himself. His mind scrambled for the right words, but they were nowhere to be found. He stopped himself, feeling the weight of 1,000 apologies on his tongue. How do you apologize for abandoning your children? How could he explain that he hadn't even known what he was missing until this very moment? Luke, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward, his expression hardening. His eyes were the same shade of blue as John's, but there was something in them, something guarded and distant, that made it clear he wasn't interested in small talk. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice sharp, demanding an answer. "You don't look like some random stranger. Are you someone we should know?" John's stomach churned. He had hoped for a moment, a chance to reconnect, to somehow bridge the gap between the father he used to be and the man standing before them now. But the truth was, there was no bridge. There were only the years he had spent away from them, the years that had shaped them into people he didn't know. The girl in front of him, with her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, seemed like a stranger. The boy beside her, tall and broad-shouldered, had the same eyes, but there was no warmth in them. Only cold distance. John took a deep breath and spoke, his voice low but firm, "I'm your father." It felt surreal saying the words out loud, as if they belonged to someone else, someone from a distant past. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lily and Luke exchanged a look, their faces unreadable. John's heart hammered in his chest, and for a moment, he wasn't sure whether they believed him or if they thought he was some kind of imposter. His breath caught in his throat as he waited for their reaction, but neither of them said anything right away. It was Lily who spoke first, her voice laced with bitterness. "Dad?" She let out a small, incredulous laugh, shaking her head. "Is that what you think you are?" Her words were sharp, but there was pain buried beneath them. "You left us. You left us when we needed you the most." The word stung more than John had anticipated. He had spent so many years hiding behind his wealth, his career, trying to convince himself that the decision to walk away hadn't been that big of a deal. But now, in the presence of these two young adults who bore his blood, who carried the weight of his abandonment with them, he realized the truth. He had made a terrible mistake. Luke crossed his arms over his chest, his posture defensive. "You don't get to show up now and pretend like everything's fine. You don't get to walk back into our lives and just say, 'Oh, I'm your dad.' You think that's enough?" His words were filled with resentment, and John couldn't blame him. He had no right to expect forgiveness, no right to demand that they accept him as their father after so many years of silence. John opened his mouth to speak, to explain, but the words felt hollow. What could he possibly say to undo the damage? How could he explain that, back when he left, he had been blinded by his own ambition, his own greed? He had told himself it was for their future, that his sacrifices would somehow make up for the time he spent away. But it hadn't. It had only made things worse. Lily's eyes, now brimming with unshed tears, softened slightly as she looked at him. "You don't get to say you're sorry now. You don't get to show up and act like you're some hero. You weren't there when we needed you. You weren't there when Mom was crying in the kitchen, trying to keep things together while we were falling apart. You weren't there for any of it." Her words hit John like a punch to the gut. He had known, deep down, that he had failed them. But hearing it, hearing how much pain his absence had caused, how much Emily had endured on her own, made him feel like the worst kind of father. "I'm sorry," John finally managed to say, his voice breaking. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything from you. But I need you to know. I never meant to hurt you. I was just so caught up in everything else, in trying to build something that I thought mattered. But I see now. I see how much I've lost." Lily's expression didn't change. She wasn't ready to forgive him. And John knew she might never be. He couldn't take back the years he had missed, the birthdays, the school events, the quiet moments of raising his children. He had missed it all. And he couldn't blame them for hating him. Luke spoke again, this time softer, but still with an edge of suspicion in his voice. "So, what now? You just think you can come in and fix everything? That's not how this works." John shook his head, his mind spinning. He didn't have the answers, didn't have some magic solution to undo the past. All he could do was try to be there now, try to rebuild the broken pieces of a relationship that had never truly formed. But it wouldn't be easy. He knew that. "I'm not asking you to forget," John said, his voice steady now. "But I want to try. I want to be part of your lives, if you'll let me. I know I've messed up. But I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." Lily and Luke didn't respond right away. They stood there, silent, watching him with eyes that seemed to weigh his every word. John didn't know what the future held, or if they would ever allow him back into their lives. But for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. And as he watched them walk away, leaving him standing in the crowded mall, John realized that this was just the beginning. He had a long way to go if he ever hoped to earn their trust again, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to try. John stood there, alone in the middle of the bustling mall, his mind whirling with the conversation that had just unfolded. He had tried to bridge the gap between his past and present, but the chasm between him and his children felt wider than ever. His heart felt heavy, weighed down with regret and guilt. He watched Lily and Luke walk away, their figures receding into the crowd, their backs turned on him as though he had never been there. And in some ways, he realized he hadn't been. Not for years. He had been absent, emotionally, physically, and no amount of words or promises could erase that. It wasn't just the years that had separated them. It was the trust he had shattered, the silence he had chosen over their cries, the decisions that had slowly eroded any chance of a meaningful relationship. Emily had been the glue that held everything together while he had been consumed by his ambition, chasing dreams of success that had ultimately only left him more isolated, more alone. Now, standing in the midst of a sea of strangers, John felt the full weight of his choices. His wealth, his power, his status, it all seemed so insignificant in this moment. What did it matter if he had it all, if the people who truly mattered to him were lost to him forever? As he walked through the mall, his thoughts consumed by guilt, he couldn't shake the image of Lily and Luke's faces. He could still hear the pain in Lily's voice, the bitterness in Luke's words. He couldn't blame them. They had every right to be angry. But as the crowd around him bustled with the noise of shopping bags and conversation, John felt like an outsider, a man completely disconnected from the world around him. The faces of the people passing by seemed to blur, their lives continuing as if nothing had changed. But for John, everything had changed. His mind raced, replaying the events of the past with a clarity he had never allowed himself before. The decision to leave Emily and the kids had been driven by his desire to climb higher, to achieve more, to prove something he could never quite define. At the time, he had convinced himself that he was doing the right thing, that his family would understand someday. He would be successful, he told himself, and then he could make it all right. But the years had passed, and the more successful he became, the more distant they all seemed. His career flourished, but his personal life crumbled. Now, the very thing he had sacrificed everything for felt like a hollow victory. John had spent so many years convincing himself that his work, his achievements, were what mattered most. But what did it all mean now? As he stood there, alone in the mall, he realized that the life he had built was empty without the people who should have been by his side. The wealth, the cars, the fancy dinners, the high-rise apartments, they couldn't fill the void he felt. And the truth hit him like a wave, he had made a catastrophic mistake. He left the mall soon after the encounter, his mind still reeling. The air outside was cool, but it felt heavy as he walked toward his car. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by a deep sense of loss. He had always been so certain that success was the answer, that if he just worked hard enough, pushed through enough obstacles, he would have everything he needed. But now he saw it differently. Now, he realized that no amount of money or accolades could replace the time he had lost with his children, the years of missed opportunities to build a relationship with them, to be a father. As John slid into the driver's seat of his car, the silence was deafening. His fingers gripped the steering wheel, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Lily and Luke, about how their lives had unfolded without him. He had no idea what kind of people they had become, how they had navigated the challenges of adolescence without a father. But he knew one thing for certain, he had no one to blame but himself. In the days that followed, John couldn't shake the feeling of regret. Every moment, every decision, seemed to lead him to this point, this realization that he had failed as a father. He tried to distract himself with work, diving into business deals and meetings, but it was no use. The emptiness inside him was impossible to ignore. He had reached the pinnacle of success, and yet he felt more isolated than ever. His life had become a blur of meetings and deadlines, but there was no joy, no fulfillment, no purpose. He wasn't sure what he was working toward anymore. He had everything, and yet, he had nothing. It wasn't just the lack of his children in his life that bothered him. It was the guilt of knowing that he had allowed his relationship with Emily to fall apart too. She had been his anchor, the one person who had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. She had been the one to keep the family together when he chose his career over them. The love they had once shared seemed so distant now, like a dream he couldn't quite recall. He had let her go, too, convinced that he was doing the right thing by chasing his ambition. But now, he saw the truth. He had let her slip through his fingers, and with her, he had lost everything. John reached out to Emily several times after his encounter with the twins, hoping for a conversation, hoping for a chance to explain himself. But every call went unanswered. His messages remained unread. He understood, of course. She had moved on, built a life for herself and their children without him. But the silence was deafening. It was a reminder of how far gone everything was, how much time had passed since he had last seen her, since he had last been a part of their world. Weeks turned into months, and John's feelings of guilt only deepened. The success he had once prided himself on seemed so hollow now, so insignificant in the grand scheme of things. He started questioning everything, his career, his choices, his priorities. What was the point of all of it? What was the point of chasing wealth and status if it meant losing the people who truly mattered? Finally, John made a decision. He couldn't change the past, but he could try to change the future. He needed to atone for his mistakes, to make amends for the years he had taken for granted. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could start by being there now. For Lily. For Luke. For Emily. It wasn't going to be easy, and he knew it might take years to rebuild the trust he had destroyed. But he was willing to try. He was willing to fight for a second chance, even if it meant facing rejection, even if it meant having to prove himself all over again. For the first time in a long time, John felt like he had something worth fighting for. And it wasn't the empire he had built or the wealth he had accumulated. It was his family, the family he had once abandoned, but now, he hoped, could somehow be his redemption. John's resolve hardened as the weeks passed. He knew there was no easy fix for the years of abandonment, no simple apology that could erase the damage done. But the more he thought about his choices, the more he realized that this was his only chance. If he wanted any hope of reconnecting with his children, he had to be patient, persistent, and most importantly, humble. He began with small, almost imperceptible steps, deciding to spend less time on work and more time reflecting on what had gone wrong in his life. His business meetings, which used to be his world, suddenly felt less important. He started keeping his phone turned off during family dinners, making a conscious effort to disconnect from the demands of his empire, if only for a few hours. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The first step toward reconciliation came when John decided to reach out to Emily. He had thought about it countless times in the days following his confrontation with the twins at the mall, but the thought of contacting her again felt daunting. He had already failed her once, and the fear of rejection loomed heavily over him. Still, he couldn't let fear dictate his actions any longer. He knew he had to try. The first call he made went straight to voicemail. He left a message, his voice shaky, barely containing the lump in his throat. "Emily," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "it's John. I know I don't deserve the chance to speak to you, but I need you to know. I'm sorry. I've been a fool, and I've failed you. But I'm not giving up. I'm not asking for anything. I want to try. Please, just hear me out." When the voicemail beeped, John felt a sinking pit in his stomach. He didn't expect a response, and when one didn't come the next day, he wasn't surprised. But he also wasn't ready to give up. Over the next few weeks, he kept trying, text messages, emails, and occasional phone calls, though each attempt was met with silence. It hurt, but he had expected it. Emily had built a life without him, and though he wanted desperately to make things right, he knew it would take time. He had already abandoned her once, he couldn't afford to make the same mistake again. He couldn't afford to give up this time. Meanwhile, he began looking for ways to get closer to Lily and Luke. He knew that if he could somehow make things right with them, Emily might soften. She had always been protective of their children, and if they saw him as someone who had truly changed, perhaps she would give him the chance to explain himself. But reaching out to them was no easier than contacting Emily. They had their own lives, their own world, and the last thing they probably wanted was to reconnect with the man who had walked away without a second thought. Still, John couldn't just sit back and let time slip away. After much deliberation, he decided to send a letter. He knew it was a small gesture, but it felt like the right first step. He spent hours drafting it, carefully choosing his words, trying to strike a balance between accountability and vulnerability. He had no idea how they would respond, or if they would even read it, but he couldn't let his fear stop him from trying. He poured everything into the letter, expressing his regret and his desire to make things right. Lily, Luke, he wrote, I know I don't have the right to ask anything of you, but I want you to know that I've spent the last few months thinking about what I did, and how I failed you. I can never change the past, but I am here now. I want to get to know you, if you'll let me. I know it will take time, but I am willing to wait. Please know that I'm sorry, and that I care about you both, more than words can say. He sent the letter, his hands trembling as he sealed the envelope. It felt like the first real step toward redemption, but it was also terrifying. He had no idea how they would respond, or if they would respond at all. The thought of being rejected, of his attempt to make things right falling flat, haunted him. But he knew that without trying, there would be no chance at all. And so, he waited. The waiting was the hardest part. Days turned into weeks, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. Every time he checked his phone, he half expected a message from either Emily or the twins. He held his breath each time the notification pinged, only to exhale in disappointment when it wasn't from them. But he kept holding on to the sliver of hope that one day, they might come around, that one day they might see the man he was now, not the man he had been. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat as he hesitated, unsure whether he should answer. But then he took a deep breath and picked it up. Hello? The voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was Lily. Is this really you? She asked, her voice trembling slightly, as though she was still unsure if this was all real. John's voice cracked. Yes, it's me. Lily, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I know, she interrupted softly, and there was a long pause. I read your letter. It took me a while to process it all, but I get it now. I get that you've changed. And I don't know what this means, but maybe we could start over? Maybe we could try again? John felt like a weight had been lifted from his chest. He could barely believe it, but her words filled him with hope. Lily, I don't deserve that chance, but I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I've changed. I'm here now, and I want to be part of your life. Please, just give me the opportunity. I can't promise everything will be perfect, Lily said, her voice still cautious, but warmer now. But, we can try. It's a start. The conversation ended with tentative optimism, and as John hung up, tears filled his eyes. It wasn't perfect, and he knew there was still a long road ahead, but it was a beginning. The door was cracked open, and he was ready to step through it. For the first time in years, John felt a spark of hope in his chest, a belief that maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild the relationship he had torn apart. It wasn't going to be easy, and he knew there would be setbacks, but this was the first real chance he had. The first chance to be the father. John's heart raced as he hung up the phone with Lily. The air felt thinner, the world outside his window a little brighter, but his mind was still buzzing with uncertainty. She had said they could try again, but John knew that words alone wouldn't heal the wounds he had caused. He had let so much time slip away. He had allowed pride, ambition, and fear to cloud his judgment for so long, and now, the challenge was monumental. How could he make things right with Lily and Luke after so many years of absence? How could he prove to them that he had changed, that he was no longer the man who walked out on them without a second thought. That night, he barely slept. Every moment felt heavy with the weight of his past actions. As dawn broke, John found himself sitting at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee, staring blankly at the wall. His mind wandered back to the day he left, the day he told Emily he was going to build an empire, one that would make everything better. At that moment, he believed it, truly did. But now, the empire seemed like nothing more than a hollow monument to his arrogance. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. John went through a mix of fear, hope, and impatience. He was desperate to make up for lost time, but he also understood that nothing would happen overnight. Lily had agreed to try again, but that didn't mean she was ready to forgive him, nor did it mean Luke would immediately warm up to him. The last thing John wanted to do was rush things or force an unnatural bond with his children. He had learned that much in the past few months: you can't rush healing. Relationships take time, especially when they've been broken for as long as his had been. He decided to give them space, to let them come to him when they were ready. Instead of pushing too hard, John started showing up in ways that felt real, grounded, and genuine. He knew that actions spoke louder than words, and he had a lot to prove. So, instead of sending gifts or making grand gestures, John began by simply showing up when they least expected it. He started frequenting the places he knew they would be: parks, local cafes, and even the bookstore they had once loved. Nothing dramatic, nothing over the top, but small, subtle moments where he could be present. He'd wave at Lily from across the room, offering a soft smile, a look that conveyed, "I'm here." Each time she saw him, the look in her eyes softened just a bit, but he could tell she was still cautious. And he couldn't blame her. One evening, about 2 weeks after their phone conversation, John walked into the bookstore and saw Lily sitting at a table in the back, her nose buried in a book. She didn't see him, but he saw her, and in that moment, everything about his journey to redemption clicked. He didn't need grand gestures. He didn't need to prove anything except that he was willing to show up, to be there in the everyday moments. Quietly, without drawing attention, John walked up to her table and sat across from her. Should have been all along. Lily didn't look up immediately, but when she did, there was no shock in her eyes, just a quiet recognition. She didn't smile, but she didn't look angry either. "You just can't stay away, can you?" she said, her tone playful but guarded. John smiled, though it was a smile tinged with sorrow. "I'm trying not to. I thought I'd let you decide how much space you need, but I'm here. Whenever you're ready." There was a long pause, and Lily seemed to consider his words carefully. Then, slowly, she closed her book and set it aside. "I'm not sure how this is supposed to work," she said. "I'm still not sure I'm ready to forgive you, but I can see you're trying. I just need to know that you won't disappear again. That you're really here for the long haul." John felt the knot in his stomach loosen a little. "I'm not going anywhere. I know it's not enough to just show up. I've got a long way to go, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Just tell me what I can do. I'll do it." Lily nodded slowly, as if weighing his sincerity. "We'll see. But it's a start." For the first time in years, John felt a flicker of hope, but he knew this was just the beginning. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was progress. It was a crack in the wall he had built around their relationship, and he was willing to wait, to earn the trust he had lost. Days passed, and with every small interaction, John began to feel a sense of calm settling over him. He hadn't expected it to be easy, and it wasn't. But there were moments, small ones, that hinted at the possibility of a real connection. Luke had started to come around, albeit slowly. He would nod in recognition when he saw John at the local gym, though their conversations were still short and awkward. But they were conversations, nonetheless. John cherished them, even the briefest exchanges. The healing was happening, just not in the way he had imagined it. Then, one afternoon, John received a call from Emily. His heart skipped a beat when he saw her name on the screen. He hadn't heard from her in weeks. He answered immediately. "John," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About the kids. About us. I know you've been trying, and I can see that. But I also know you can't just undo the years that passed. You can't fix it all overnight." "I know," he said softly, his voice filled with regret. "I don't expect it to be easy. I need to show you that I'm here for the long haul, that I'm not the same person I was when I left." There was a long silence on the other end, and John's stomach churned with nerves. Then Emily spoke again, her voice softer now, less guarded. "I know you can't undo the past. But maybe, just maybe, we can find a way forward. For the kids. For us. Let's start with that." John felt a surge of emotion, but he swallowed it down, knowing this was only the beginning. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had a real chance at redemption. The next few months were slow but steady. John continued to show up, to be there for Lily and Luke in the little ways that mattered. He didn't force anything, didn't rush the healing process, but he remained constant. Slowly, very slowly, the walls between them began to lower. Lily started to call him more often, asking about his day or just checking in. Luke began to open up, talking to him about things he never would have a year ago. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, times when John would feel the sting of their anger or disappointment. But through it all, he never wavered. He had learned the hard way that some things take time, real relationships, real connections, and the chance to rebuild what was broken. And while he could never undo the past, John was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future was still within his reach. As the months passed, John continued to navigate the delicate waters of reconciliation with Emily, Lily, and Luke. Each day felt like a small victory, each conversation a step closer to mending the fractures that had once felt irreparable. But he knew better than to let his guard down completely. The emotional wounds were still fresh, and they couldn't be healed overnight. It was a slow process, one filled with ups and downs, moments of breakthrough, but also setbacks. But John had come to understand that the most important part of this journey was not the destination, but the willingness to continue on, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. One afternoon, John found himself sitting on the porch of the house he once shared with Emily. The wind rustled through the trees, and the sun was beginning to set, casting a soft glow across the yard. It felt surreal, like he was a visitor in his own past. He had spent so many years thinking about this moment, about what it would feel like to return, but now that he was here, it was far more complex than he had imagined. Emily had invited him over for dinner, a simple gesture, but one that meant more than he could express. They hadn't yet moved past the formality of their conversations, but this invitation felt like a bridge, a sign that she was willing to open the door to a new chapter, however cautiously. As John sat there, he reflected on everything that had brought him to this point. The lavish life he had once lived, the countless business deals and meetings that had consumed his every waking moment, all of it now seemed so distant, so insignificant compared to the fragile relationships he was trying to rebuild. He had spent so many years running from his past, avoiding the pain, the mistakes, but in doing so, he had missed out on the one thing that truly mattered, connection. Now, as he looked at the house he once called home, John felt a profound sense of loss, but also a glimmer of hope. Dinner was a quiet affair. Emily had prepared a simple meal, and for the first time in years, John felt a sense of comfort in the familiarity of their surroundings. They spoke in cautious tones, filling the space with small talk and pleasantries. There were no grand emotional confessions, no sweeping gestures, just two people, sitting together, sharing a meal and a moment. But in the quiet pauses between their words, John could feel the unspoken weight of their shared history. He could see the pain in Emily's eyes, the hesitation in her voice, but he also saw something else, a flicker of trust, a small but significant shift in the way she looked at him. After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching the stars begin to emerge in the evening sky. John was keenly aware of the distance between them, the space that still existed, but for the first time, it didn't feel insurmountable. There was a subtle shift in the air, a quiet understanding that perhaps, just perhaps, they were both ready to begin again. "You've changed," Emily said, breaking the silence. "I can see it. It's not just the way you talk, but the way you show up. You're here. You're really here." John nodded, the weight of her words settling deep within him. "I am. And I'm sorry for all the years I wasn't. I can't change the past, but I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to feel abandoned again. You and the kids deserve more than what I gave you before." Emily's gaze softened. "I know you're trying. And that means more to me than you realize. But it's not just about saying the right things or doing the right things. It's about showing us that we can trust you again." John took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I understand. Trust isn't something I can expect, not after everything that's happened. But I'll do everything I can to earn it. Every day, in every way. I won't stop trying." Emily sat back, her eyes reflecting the glow of the stars above. "It won't be easy. It'll take time. But I'm willing to give it a chance. For the kids. For all of us." John felt a surge of hope, but also a quiet understanding that the journey was far from over. Rebuilding trust was not a one-time event, it was a continuous process, one that would require patience, vulnerability, and consistency. But he was ready. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond his business, beyond the wealth and status that had once defined him. His purpose now was to be present for the people who mattered most, his family. The days that followed were filled with small but meaningful gestures. John made an effort to be there for Lily and Luke, attending their school events, showing up for soccer games, and simply spending time with them. He knew that actions spoke louder than words, and he was determined to prove that he was there to stay. Each time he saw a glimmer of recognition in their eyes, a small smile from Luke or a soft laugh from Lily, he felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect, but it was progress. But it wasn't just about what John was doing for them, it was about what they were doing for him as well. Emily, Lily, and Luke were teaching him what it truly meant to be a family. They were teaching him patience, resilience, and the importance of emotional connection. In the years he had spent building his empire, John had neglected the most fundamental aspect of life, the relationships that sustained us. Now, he was learning that true success wasn't measured by profits or achievements, but by the people who stood by your side, by the love and trust you cultivated over time. One evening, as John was finishing up a long day of work at home, he received a message from Emily. It was simple, yet it filled him with more warmth than he had felt in years. "Lily and Luke want to spend the weekend with you. They're ready." John felt a lump rise in his throat as he read the message again. It wasn't just the invitation that moved him, it was the fact that Lily and Luke were willing to take that step, to trust him enough to spend time with him. It was the beginning of something new, something he had only dreamed of for so long. That weekend, as he spent time with Lily and Luke, John realized that the healing process was ongoing, a journey with no set endpoint. There would be moments of doubt, of fear, of setbacks. But there would also be moments of joy, of connection, of rebuilding. And through it all, John knew that he was no longer the man who had abandoned them. He was the man who had learned, who had changed, who was committed to showing up every single day. As the weekend came to a close, John sat with Lily and Luke on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was a quiet moment, but for John, it felt like everything had come full circle. He wasn't perfect, and there was still so much work to do, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. The future was still uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure, he was no longer running from his past. He was facing it head-on, with a renewed sense of purpose, and with the hope that, in time, he could earn back the trust and love he had once thrown away. And as the stars began to twinkle overhead, John knew that the journey was far from over, it was just beginning.